So we have with us today Member of Parliament Leah Gazan, Senator Paul Prosper, and Zoe Craig-Sparrow. If you will all, I believe, have an opening statement, and then we will go to the room for questions, one question and one answer. So go ahead.
Okay, sure. Good morning. Waliasik Bug. My name is PJ Prosper, and I am a senator for Nova Scotia, Mi'kma'ki. I am a former chief of Buckingham Mi'kmaq Nation and a former AFN regional chief. Earlier today, I had the honor and privilege to stand with National Chief Woodhouse, Chief Nikki Van Orishaud, and members of Caldwell First Nation. I heard the heartbreaking stories of those directly impacted by ongoing discriminatory policies, such as the second generation cutoff. Chief Orishaud's comments sum up perfectly why we are here today. She noted that community recognition is not the same as legal recognition. Status is currently the only link we have to critical supports and programming only made available to those with status. Status is manufactured recognition, but it is the only legal recognition accepted by the government of Canada. I brought the Senate amendments to this bill forward. For me, ending the second generation cutoff is the most important issue I am working on. Let us be clear. The second generation cutoff is a assimilationist policy. It is legislated extinguishment of our inherent Aboriginal and treaty rights. Since the Senate passed this bill as amended by a vote of 63-0 with 8 abstentions, I have received copies of over 4,100 letters of support from individuals and First Nation leaders. Over 10,400 signatures were gathered for e-petition 7200, calling for the immediate passage of S2 as amended. Over 500 First Nation communities and counting, and dozens of First Nation organizations support these amendments. That is why I find it baffling that the government continues to delay on the basis of needing more consultation. No other order of government requires unanimity before moving forward. Today, Conservative MP Billy Morin moved the motion calling for an end to the study, an immediate clause-by-clause consideration of S2 by June 16. Bloc MP Marilyn Gill asked tough but fair questions of the minister. NDP MP Leah Gazan is graciously hosting this press conference. Today, every opposition party has proven concretely that they are standing with us, pushing the end to this discrimination. I would like to end with a statement from my friend and colleague, Senatrice Michelle Audette, who unfortunately was unable to join us today. She provides, and I quote, as part of his mandate, Prime Minister Mark Carney is seeking solutions to the challenges facing Canada. With Bill S2, the Senate has put forward thoughtful solutions based on expert advice. The calls made this week by Indigenous leaders and advocates demonstrate the urgent need for action. I hope that government will give this bill the attention it deserves by making it a priority for the benefit of all communities involved. It is time to put First Nations first and pass Bill S2 as amended before the summer recess. Merci. Thank you, Walalio.
Thank you so much, Senator Prosper, and I felt it fitting for you to start the press conference because of the tremendous work that you've done in the Senate, standing with First Nations women like myself as a good ally in the Senate, and I want to thank you for that. As you know, I'm joined today by Senator Prosper and Justice for Girls Vice President Zoe Craig-Sparrow, who has been an outstanding advocate fighting for the rights of First Nations women and is here with us today, flying all the way from British Columbia just to be here in person today. And I want to thank you both for your strong and principled stance against the ongoing injustices, the ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples being perpetrated by this government. As you know, Bill S2 amends the Indian Act to correct inequalities in clauses dealing with registration and status recognition. Amendments to S2 in the Senate have moved to the end to end the second generation cutoff by which after 2 generations of First Nations parenting with a non-status person and their children's status is being denied under the Indian Act. And I want to remind us all that one of the goals of assimilation was to eradicate us until we were seamlessly integrated into what they called the body politic. Bill S2 was drafted to comply with the Nicholas ruling last year from the BC Supreme Court, which found that enfranchisement rules in the Indian Act violated the Charter, but has been stalled, unfortunately, by the Liberal government since the Senate amended it to end the second generation cutoff. The court gave the government until April to pass the legislation. We are now in June. Amending the Indian Act to amend the Indian Act and has denied the government's request for an extension. The government is able to appeal once more and appears to be waiting until the very last minute to do so to further stall the process. Now, I want to be very clear that we know and certainly has been agreed upon across party line that the second generation cutoff hurts Indigenous people everywhere and contributes to an ongoing genocide as the government seeks to deny our indigeneity and our status under the Indian Act. A genocide that was recognized by the Permanent People's Tribunal just 2 weeks ago, not as a previous genocide, but as an ongoing genocide against Indigenous people in their preliminary findings, the second generation cutoff being just one act in a number of acts of the ongoing genocide against Indigenous peoples. And again, I want to thank you, Senator Prosper, for this hard work to ensure that this legislation rectifies this grave injustice. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls concluded that Canada has committed genocide against Indigenous peoples through a series of colonial structures and policies. And I'd like to point to former Right Honorable Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who accepted the findings of the National Inquiry, including its findings that what was happening to Indigenous women and girls and diverse gendered people was an ongoing genocide. Many Indigenous advocates place the second generation cutoff within this broader framework, arguing that policies that reduce Indigenous populations through legal definitions contribute to the ongoing destruction of Indigenous peoples as distinct nations. In short, the second generation cutoff is often understood not as an isolated registration rule, but part of a broader continuum of colonial violence. Whereas earlier policies relied on coercive institutions such as residential schools and forced enfranchisement, the cutoff operates through legal definitions of identity and belonging with the effect of reducing the number of people recognized by the state as Indigenous over time. Something that Minister Manigault Masti should understand as a member of Waswanipi, as a member of the James Bay Cree, who understood this even prior to the amendment and has for their nation a one-parent rule to avoid this colonial genocide that continues. Right now, the government has a legal obligation to pass the bill. And yet, even as the courts have set binding deadlines for them to meet the end of discrimination, the government is now pulling out every delay tactic in the book to continue violating the rights of Indigenous peoples. Let's remember, when it comes to legislation that violated Indigenous Section 35 rights, such as Bill C-5, the Liberal government has ignored the calls of Indigenous peoples, failed their constitutional duty to consult, and bulldozed every parliamentary procedure to fast-track it into law. We saw that just the past summer with the passing of Bill C-5. At this very moment, last year, as I indicated, Indigenous leaders from coast to coast to coast were demanding that Prime Minister Carney pause his fast-tracking of the so-called Building Canada Act and to consult with them to ensure major projects did not undermine their rights. In June of last year, I stood alongside the Chiefs of Ontario outside the House of Commons, demanding that the Liberal government stop ignoring its constitutional duty to free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people and yet the government ignored their voices and passed Bill C-5 before a summer adjournment. Yet now, with Bill S-2, a bill that is attempting to right the wrongs of the past, to uphold the right of Indigenous peoples, the government is saying that it cannot move too fast. This is a blatant double standard, which by now has become totally unsurprising from the Carney Liberal government. He'll move fast for big corporations and CEOs, but not for Indigenous peoples with constitutional right, including Indigenous women and girls and diverse gendered folks, where we see an increase in violence, where we see cutbacks to dollars to end the ongoing genocide of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and to stall a process to end discrimination against Indigenous women in the Indian Act, the kind of discrimination that was likened as genocidal by the Permanent Peoples Tribunal in their preliminary findings. And I reiterate the calls of those who join me today, of all Indigenous peoples protesting on Parliament Hill today, demanding the government pass S2 as amended before adjourning the House. Thank you so much, and I'll now hand it over to you, Zoe. Thank you.
Great.
Aiswail and the Zoe Craig-Sparrow, Tlitsnak Humathquim. My name is Zoe Craig-Sparrow, and I am from the Hunkamunam-speaking Humathquim peoples and was born and raised on Musqueam Indian Reserve No. 2 in what is now known as Vancouver. You've heard a lot about the second generation cutoff. I am the cutoff. My mother is a full 6'1" status Indian and my father was not status, so I was granted 6'2" half status. My father passed away when I was 9 years old, and I grew up on the reserve with my mother, next door to my grandpa, my grandma, my aunt, and my family. And my grandpa raised me fishing on the Fraser River. I met my now fiancé on Musqueam, who is not First Nations but also grew up on the reserve. And we're getting married in October and plan to have children together soon. But our children will not have status. In the eyes of the government, they will not be First Nations. They will not be able to inherit the home that I own, right next to my mother's. And they will not be able to exercise their Aboriginal right to fish. My babies won't even be allowed on the boat with me. They won't be able to play in the First Nations soccer tournaments with their cousins. Despite Minister Galmasti saying today in INAN that status is just about benefits, it is so much more. It is identity, belonging, community, culture, and access to rights and services. And this is especially crucial for Indigenous women and girls who are experiencing genocide and disproportionately high rates of violence. When we say this will lead to legislated extinction in 3 to 4 generations, we mean of entire nations and peoples. But this is happening now with real and tangible impacts for people and families like me and mine. Despite a clear opportunity for the government to end the sex and race-based discrimination and this flagrant violation of both international law and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we've been faced with typical government tactics: delays, lies, and empty promises. These are the same tactics that kept Sharon McIver fighting for over 26 years to get status for her son. The government continues to say that they need more time to consult and that a third of nations are against this. This issue has been consulted on since 1982, before the second generation cutoff was even implemented in 1985. Those consultation documents prove that the government clearly knew that it would lead to our legislated extinction when they created it. And even so, you cannot consult on genocide, forced assimilation, and discrimination. We also know that the vast majority of First Nations, over 500, are clear that the time for consultation has long passed, and now is the time to finally end this. Canada also cannot continue hiding behind the Nicholas plaintiffs, whose court case the government fought hard against and lost, and which was the impetus for Bill S2. The plaintiffs have been clear. They do not want to be used as an excuse to justify stripping out these amendments or delaying justice yet again. The government can also no longer hide behind the argument that passing Bill S2 as amended would somehow violate UNDRIP, or the rights of free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. The technical advice recently issued by the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples makes the opposite clear, that the real violation of UNDRIP is continuing the forced assimilation of our people through the second generation cutoff. And this pattern of delays is continuing. With Bill C-5, as MP Gazan just shared, the government got the bill through the House and the Senate all the way to royal assent in 20 days. We are now at almost 400 days of delays on Bill S2. Even the Canadian Citizenship Bill, which granted citizenship to 2 generations of Canadians born abroad, was pushed through faster in only 281 days. Think about that. Less than a month for major projects, and over a year and counting for sex discrimination in the Indian Act. I am not willing to bet the rights of my children and the future of my family line on a government who has never, of their own will and without being forced by a court case, made positive amendments to the Indian Act to improve our rights. A government who has never given First Nations women the rights we deserve, who still discriminates against us and bars us from compensation for our rights violations. Our rights have never been handed to us. We have always had to fight for them. And let me be clear. Passing Bill S2 as amended to end discrimination and forced assimilation now does not mean that further changes to the Indian Act that ensure First Nations control over citizenship and self-determination can't be made later. And they should be made later. But the discrimination must be dealt with first. There is no excuse to continue violating the Canadian Charter and international law. The government is running out of excuses, except for the reality that maybe they don't want Indians forever. They want us to have an end date. At least that's what their actions are showing us. And if our government and our Prime Minister actually respects human rights and international law and doesn't want the legislated extinction and forced assimilation of First Nations, then they should stop wasting time and pass Bill S2 as amended by the Senate before the House rises for the summer. And the upcoming vote on Tuesday in Inan to move to clause by clause is the first step. Heichka, thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now move to the room for questions. One question and one follow. At the moment, I don't see anyone online, so I'll keep an eye on that. We'll start with Alessia Pasafume from the Canadian Press.
Hi. My question is for you, MP Gazan. I'm wondering your reflections on your former colleague, Lori Edlout, saying that after she heard about the government's position, her mind has been changed. I know that you guys worked really close together when you were in the same caucus, and she was on side with the amendments before she went to the Liberals. Wondering what you make of that.
Well, I think, any sort of defense to keep a sexism and racism in the Indian Act is unconscionable. The fact that this government is doing everything in their power to keep discrimination in the Indian Act, something that is in clear violation of the rights of First Nations women, is abhorrent. I know that, MP Idlout has switched her position, and I encourage her to stay true to the promises she made to First Nations women across the country when she first tabled the position, and not willfully participate with the Liberal government to willfully, knowingly violate our rights and take an action that is in complete contrast to what was noted in the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls.
And I also have one for you, Zoe. The last time we talked about this, you had said that you've been trying to get a meeting with the minister for more than a year and that call wasn't answered. Have you met with her? And I believe there's also a call for you to meet with the Prime Minister.
No, we have not met with Minister Galmasti. We have been trying to get a meeting with her since May of last year, and she either does not respond to our requests or we meet with others from Indigenous Services Canada. And now, yes, we are trying to get a meeting with the Prime Minister, who also has not responded to our requests to meet.
If I can just ask quickly, when you requested the meeting with him?
Over the past month, we've issued various letters and requests and have not heard back. But we are hoping that he will meet with First Nations women leaders like Sharon McIver and like the Indian Act Sex Discrimination Working Group as soon as possible, given the urgency of the rights violations at hand.
Fraser Needham, APTN.
There was a couple of media reports recently that the Parliamentary Secretary for Indigenous Services did raise directly some concerns about their legislation with the Prime Minister in a caucus meeting. He declined an interview on it, although he didn't deny the allegations, directly leading to believe that there is some truth to them. Does anyone want to comment about that? And I think that the stories say that basically the Prime Minister said, not my problem, and carry on. So I was just wondering if anyone wanted to comment on that.
We make choices as legislators in this country. We take an oath to uphold the rule of law, and that means upholding the Constitution. All legislators, regardless of which party they are from, has an obligation to protect our Constitution. And that includes the rights of First Nations women and their descendants. I urge all Liberal members of Parliament to take their duty seriously, to push their government to move forward Bill S2 with great speed and do the right thing and vote to uphold the human rights of all peoples, including the rights of First Nations women across the country.
I guess the follow-up I would have to that is, do you think the Prime Minister is creating that environment? the follow up I'd have to that is the Prime Minister creating that environment to happen?
I can't comment on caucus matters with the Prime Minister. That is for them to do in their own party. Thank you.
Marco Vigliotti, iPolitics.
Thanks for agreeing to take our questions. One thing I wanted to ask, and to anyone who wants to take up my offer, one thing we've heard constant criticism from Liberals on the INN committee has been some of their messaging around citizenship and status, and criticism that they might be conflating the two in a deliberate attempt to justify the further need for consultations. When you're seeing those questions, when you're seeing the type of questions these Liberal MPs are putting forward, do you agree with that criticism that this is an effort to confuse the two so that they can justify further delay on moving this bill forward?
Sure, I'll provide some comments, and thank you for the question. The immediate and sole focus for the amendment bill of S2 is to deal with the subject matter of status. It deals with the legal relationship and obligations of the federal government to Indian people on the basis of essentially that status. And as mentioned certainly earlier, that has to be in line with domestic and international law. And it's clearly discriminatory, and it needs to be resolved now. With government's reference to citizenship and membership, there is certainly a time and a place for that. But that time and that place is not now. The time now is to end discrimination now, which is central to the subject of status. Within the amended bill, there is a period, a 1-year period for it to take full effect. That certainly gives government an opportunity to consult, to talk to people about implementation of that bill and maybe considerations around later processes related to citizenship and band membership. But I think it's a conflation to link the two in one and say you can't proceed with status without first trying to deal with citizenship and without dealing with band membership, because those take separate and I would add longer term discussions.
I would just like to add that I, of course, would like my nation to be self-determining, self-governing, have our own membership and citizenship codes. I would also like my children to be able to inherit my home and to be able to be born with their rights to access healthcare and services exclusive to Indian status and tied to Indian status. Those two should not be mutually exclusive, and the efforts of the government to position them as in opposition is completely untrue. We can and should and must absolutely end the discrimination first and then work towards those larger picture issues second. They're both equally as important, but there is one that is in violation of the charter that must be dealt with first now.
Thank you. And Zoe, just picking up on something you said earlier about how the Nicholas plaintiffs kind of didn't want to see this second generation issue be used as a justification, or the court deadline as a justification to not act on that. And I'll offer up the same opportunity to everyone to answer this. Do you feel like the minister is trying to play the two against each other, the Nicholas plaintiffs and those who want reforms to the second generation cutoff?
Yes, I think in the Senate Indigenous Committee in APA, the minister certainly testified to that effect, saying that there couldn't be amendments to S2 because it would delay justice for the Nicholas plaintiffs. And what we're seeing now is the amendments were made, and that's not what the delay is. The delay is now in the House Committee in INN. And the reality is that the Nicholas plaintiffs rightfully want status for their children as well, and they too don't want the second generation cutoff. Because as is now, the Nicholas case is a piecemeal approach, and we're talking about broader change that ensures the end of discrimination in the Indian Act.
Joyce Bear Chief Morris, CBC.
Hi, thanks everyone for being here. I have two questions. The first is for whoever would like to answer it, but I think maybe more specifically for Senator Leah, MP Gazan. You have mentioned a couple times that there's over 500 First Nations communities who are now in support of passing Bill S2. I'm just wondering, where does the statistic coming from? Is this a study that's been taken by the government or AFN? It's new for me to hear today, specifically this number. So I'm wondering where this number is coming from.
Sure. And thank you for the question. There has been a rather brilliant and dedicated team of individuals that have been tracking this issue for quite some time. And through the course of the bill's introduction right through to where it is today, there has been numerous forms of communication, letters, testimony, various releases that have come out. And all of that has been tracked quite methodically and to a very high degree of detail. And I could say, with a significant amount of confidence that those numbers of 500 are accurate in terms of those First Nation communities out of roughly 634, but, are in support of S2 as amended. And that number is growing. So, I can certainly look to get and provide you with further detail with respect to the methodology, if you so choose, to show that those numbers do align and reflect the true support that exists there.
Thank you. And second question is for MP Gazan. You have been a champion of the try to put residential school denialism as a hate crime in Canada. The amendments were just, I know you have the private members bill, but there were the amendments in the current legislation that were removed by the Senate. I'm just wondering for what your thoughts are, especially as you mentioned the Permanent People's Tribunal that happened a couple weeks ago.
Well, I think this is indicative of what we're seeing from Carney's Liberal government. They pick and choose when to uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples, the safety, dignity, and security of Indigenous peoples when it suits their political and economic interest and brushes them aside when it does not. I think Bill S2 and the stalling tactics in it is certainly indicative of this. Looking on their website, where they're giving performance indicators where their goal is starting at 17% reporting of gender-based violence on reserve, right? To improve it so it's only 16% reporting as a measure of progress when it should be zero. That is how blatantly discriminatory this government has been. My bill seeks to amend or to add to the criminal code residential school denialism by condoning, justifying, downplaying, or minimizing what happened in residential schools. We currently have a section within the criminal code that has dealt with Holocaust denialism. I'm very pleased about that. My bill only seeks to add to it. I have offered the bill to take it on as a government bill. It would cost no amount of money. And I want to remind everybody, when we talk about reconciliation, the government seems to just flippantly talk about economic reconciliation. But I want to remind the government the whole discussion of reconciliation was born on the backs of stories of survivors who are having their dignity, security, and safety threatened by a small group of denialists, many who are privileged from academic institution, publishing disinformation. And what I have to say is if this government cannot, at the very minimum, protect the dignity, safety, and security, something that is a charter right, of survivors, families, and communities, this government is not ready to reconcile. If this government cannot amend the Indian Act to eliminate other forms of ongoing genocide, including not supporting the amendments in S2, this government is not ready to reconcile. And I call them on their blatant turning of a blind eye, their willful turning of a blind eye on the rights of all Indigenous peoples, including First Nations women in the country. Thank you.
Mark Blackburn, APTN. Can you go to the mic, please?
I was curious, Zoe mentioned that she's tried to get a meeting with the minister. Is now asking for a minister with the meeting with the Prime Minister. Have you, Senator, have you tried to meet with Minister Gomasti and to talk to her and try to kind of gauge where she's at? And
I haven't actively reached out. She did appear before the APA committee at least on 2 occasions, and certainly made her positions known. There have been discussions that I've had with the minister leading up and during the hearings we had within the Senate. So we've met, but you know, I don't think I sent out a formal sort of a request for a meeting, but certainly we had discussions.
okay. And what did she say in those discussions?
Well, you know, basically what she has sort of put forward on record before committee. There was indication in terms of certainly with any member of parliament, certain pressures and that they have with respect to legislation and you know, things of that nature, and you know, her hope to have separate legislation to be put forward in that regard, and the processes associated with that. And, you know, suffice to say that, you know, we had a difference of opinion in terms of how we should proceed in that regard. You know, so.
If you have time for a little bit more, Alessia Pacifiume, I believe, has another question.
I'm just curious, like the minister in committee today mentioned that she got a letter from Treaty 6 chief saying they didn't feel consulted, but if I'm remembering correctly, there was no line that she read out loud that says they don't support S2. It was just the consultation bit around it. Cody Daibo, chief of Ganawage, was in front of INAN, and his thing was, as Mohawks, the Crown, we shouldn't interfere. But it wasn't, don't change the Indian Act. The minister's saying that there's First Nations who are opposed to this. I haven't personally seen any of them come out publicly. Have you?
I'd like to remind the minister that we live in a democracy. I've never seen somebody elected as government with 100% support. That argument, although I haven't seen any proof of it, is a pretty weak one. Certainly as Indigenous peoples, we have opinions that we agree on and disagree on. That's called a democracy. What we do know, even if it was true, is that the majority of First Nations support ending sexual and racial discrimination from the Indian Act. In fact, I think the minister will be hard-pressed to find Indigenous people that say we want to continue to have sexism and racism perpetrated against our well-being. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Here's an opportunity for a government to reconcile sexist and discrimination against Indigenous women at a time where rates of violence are increasing. They're cutting back on programs. Our safety and life, or lack of life, seems to be no consequence of this government to do the right thing. She is failing. And I hope that she reconsiders her bureaucratic position and stands in solidarity with other First Nations women who are saying No, it's time to abolish racism and sexism out of the Indian Act. Thank you.
Okay, with that, we still have no one online, so we will wrap up the press. Oh, did you want to? Sorry. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Just follow up on that, and thank you, Member of Parliament Gazan, for that. Just further in line with what was just mentioned, the evidence is overwhelming. When you look at the testimony before the Senate, when you look at the testimony before the INAN committee, it's been near unanimous with respect to in support of the amendments made to S2. When you look at the documentation that government departments have been getting and the committee has been getting, resolutions from all across this country in support of the amendment bill for S2, to say, wait, we need to do more consultation in the face of this, is something that I don't think is proper nor, appropriate for any government official to take at this time. There are, discrimination and racism exists, and it needs to be dealt with. And one can't, look to consultation to deny that basic right to justice. So thank you.
If I can sneak in one more very quickly, or I'll give it to Fraser.
Oh, sure.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I love the collegialism. Okay, go ahead, Fraser.
Lots of questions. And I wanted to follow up a little bit on that. I know that since the government introduced this bill last year, there's been a lot of discussion. A lot of you have been working on this very hard and diligently, and it's become pretty clear that they've dug in their heels and do not want to make any changes. And if you look at it, since I said this last June, they could have held some pretty extensive consultations in the time from then to now in that year, and I'm not sure that they have. Why do you get the sense of working on this as you have that they have dug in their heels so hard that they do not want to amend this legislation?
If I were to be quite frank about it, it's all about the money. And I think Zoe had mentioned it earlier as well with respect to the intent of introducing the second generation cutoff in the first instance, which, by the way, there was no consultation to insert it, with Indian Act. Now, all of a sudden, there's a lot of consultation that is required to take it out. That aside, it's quite plain to me that what we're looking at is the mathematical extinguishment of a people. And government has an obligation to Indigenous people, and they have obligations to status people, Indians as well. And with respect to status comes a special relationship and special obligations to legal obligations to programs and services. And I think it's all a matter about money and, having to spend more money to account for more status Indians. So I really don't think at the end of the day, it's all about consultation.
Can I?
Sure.
Just adding on to Senator's prospects comments, or Prosper comments, I think it also speaks to the normalized genocide against Indigenous women in this country. Let's not forget they've cut back funding for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. They have, by their own admission on their website, accepted violence as a norm in the community, not to eradicate violence, but to push it down to 16%. while cutting back when the rates are growing on any sort of funding, that there has been since enfranchisement, this is not a new concept, a legislative agenda to eradicate Indigenous peoples so that we could just blend into the body politic. I think this is another example of that colonial behavior. And I urge the minister, to stop playing games, to stop forcing particularly First Nations women to have to engage in silly season talk about whether we need to be consulted with about whether we want racial and sexist discrimination to be taken out of the Indian Act. I think she would be hard pressed to find anybody that would want it to stay in it. And to focus her attention more so on ensuring an improved quality life for Indigenous women, girls, and diverse gendered folks, and to spend her time implementing calls from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, including eradicating sexual discrimination from the Indian Act. I think that's a better use of her time and her power as a minister. Thank you.
Okay, and with that, we will wrap up today's press conference. Thanks so much.